You are looking at a book that no one on earth can read. Not because the ink has faded, and not because the pages have crumbled into dust. The vellum is supple, the colors are still bright after 600 years, and every letter on every page is perfectly legible, formed with the easy, unhesitating hand of someone who wrote this way every day of their life. The problem is not that the writing has been damaged by time. The problem is that nobody, in over a century of trying, has ever figured out what a single word of it means. Tonight, you are going to sit with that book for a while. You are going to turn its pages slowly, in the dark, and let yourself rest inside a mystery that refuses, again and again, to resolve. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let your breathing slow. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You only need to listen. In the spring of 1912, a Polish-born rare book dealer named Wilfred Michael Voynich traveled to a villa outside Rome called Villa Mondragone, a former Jesuit school perched in the hills above Frascati. The Society of Jesus was quietly short on money, and quietly nervous about a political climate in Italy that had already forced religious orders to surrender property before. So the Jesuits at the Collegio Romano had done what institutions under threat often do: they moved their most valuable books somewhere less visible, and they let a trusted dealer come and make an offer on some of them, discreetly, away from public account books and public attention. Voynich had spent years building relationships exactly like this one. He had a reputation for finding things other people had stopped looking for. Picture him there, in a dim library room stacked with trunks of manuscripts nobody had properly catalogued in generations. He is a heavy-set man in his late 40s, meticulous, restless, the kind of person who reads spines the way other people read faces. He works through box after box of unremarkable devotional texts and administrative correspondence. And then, in one chest, he finds something that stops him completely. It is small, about the size of a modern hardcover novel, roughly 6 inches by 9. Vellum pages, somewhere around 240 of them, though a handful are clearly missing, cut or torn away at some point in the book's life. And it is covered, cover to cover, in a script unlike anything Voynich, a man who had handled thousands of old books and knew dozens of scripts, ciphers, and shorthands, had ever encountered. Not Latin. Not Greek. Not Hebrew, not Arabic, not any recognizable alphabet at all. Elegant, flowing characters, some resembling numerals, some resembling nothing at all, marching across the page in tight, confident lines, exactly the way a person writes when they are not translating an unfamiliar alphabet letter by letter, but simply writing, the way you or I write our own names without thinking about it. And the illustrations are stranger still. Page after page of plants, root systems, leaves, flowers, carefully drawn and colored, except that when you look closely, none of them match any species a botanist can identify. Some seem to be composites, a root from one kind of plant fused to leaves from another, flowers that belong to no known family. Further in, the book opens into a section of circular astronomical diagrams, wheels within wheels, labeled with tiny figures and symbols arranged like a zodiac, though the labeling makes no obvious sense against any known calendar. And then, strangest of all, dozens of pages showing small nude women, rendered without any pretense of anatomical realism, standing or reclining in green-tinted pools that are connected to one another by elaborate networks of pipes and tubes, like a diagram of some plumbing system built entirely out of bath water and bodies. Voynich bought a group of manuscripts that day, but this was the one he could not stop thinking about. He would spend the rest of his life trying to find out what it said, and he would fail. So would his wife. So would everyone who came after them, all the way up to today, sitting somewhere in the world right now, staring at the same impossible pages on a laptop screen at 2 in the morning, certain that this time, they are the one who is finally going to crack it. We now call it the Voynich Manuscript, after the man who found it. And for over 100 years, it has held the same unbroken record, the most famous unsolved mystery in the entire history of writing. Let yourself sit with that thought for a moment, in the quiet. A book that is not lost, not damaged, not hidden. Sitting right now, catalogued and photographed and available for anyone in the world to look at online, completely readable in every sense except the one that matters. Rest here. There is nowhere you need to be. Wilfred Voynich himself had lived a life strange enough that finding an impossible book almost feels fitting. Born in Poland under Russian occupation, he had been arrested as a young man for revolutionary political activity, imprisoned, and exiled to Siberia, before eventually escaping across the frozen landscape and making his way to London, where he reinvented himself as an antiquarian bookseller with an eye for exactly the kind of overlooked, undervalued treasure other dealers walked past. His wife, Ethel Lillian Voynich, was a novelist, and her book, The Gadfly, a story of revolution and sacrifice set in Italy, would go on to become one of the best-selling works of fiction in the Soviet Union, required reading for generations of Soviet schoolchildren, translated into dozens of languages, selling in the millions, a strange kind of fame that had nothing at all to do with her husband's book, running in parallel to it for decades. Between the two of them, the Voynich household held one of the strangest literary legacies of the 20th century, one spouse famous across an entire empire for a book everyone could read, the other spending his life on a book no one could. Tucked inside the manuscript, Voynich found something almost as intriguing as the book itself, a letter, folded and worn, dated the 14th of August, 1665 or 1666, the ink is smudged enough that scholars still argue about which. It was written by a man named Johannes Marcus Marci, a respected physician and rector of Prague University, and it was addressed to one of the most famous intellectuals in Europe at the time, a Jesuit polymath named Athanasius Kircher, who had built a reputation as a man who could decipher anything. He claimed, wrongly as it turned out, to have translated Egyptian hieroglyphics decades before anyone actually could. In the letter, Marci explains that he is sending Kircher a strange book, written in an unknown character, which he says had once belonged to Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, who reigned from Prague in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Marci relays a story he'd heard, secondhand, already old gossip by the time it reached him, that Rudolf had paid 600 gold ducats for the book, an enormous sum, because he believed it to be the work of the 13th century English friar and early scientist Roger Bacon. Marci himself sounds uncertain about all of this. He is simply passing the story along, the way you might mention that a strange old lamp in your attic supposedly once belonged to somebody famous, without being able to say for certain that it's true. There is a fainter signature on the manuscript's very first page that seems to confirm at least part of that chain, even if it can't confirm the Roger Bacon story itself. Under ultraviolet light, researchers can make out the partially erased name of Jacobus Horsicki de Tepanek, sometimes known by the Latinized name Sinapius, who served as Rudolf's court physician and was ennobled by the emperor in the early 1600s, in part for his knowledge of botany and medicine. If that reading is correct, it places the book plausibly inside Rudolf's court, in the hands of a man whose entire profession revolved around exactly the kind of plant knowledge the manuscript's herbal pages seem to be reaching for. Marci's own letter actually reveals one more link in the chain, one that rarely gets its due beside more famous names like Dee, Kelly, and Bacon. Decades before Marcy ever sent the book to Kircher, it had belonged to a lesser-known Prague alchemist named George Baresch, a man largely forgotten by history except for the fact that he became quietly obsessed with this exact manuscript. Baresch wrote to Kircher himself back in 1639, more than 25 years before Marcy's own letter, describing a book full of unknown characters and strange plants, and pleading for help translating it, half convinced it held real Egyptian-style secret wisdom worth the effort. Kircher never solved it either. When Baresch died, the book passed to a friend, Jan Marek Marcy, the very same Marcy who would eventually mail it onward with his own letter, closing a loop of failed Prague scholars that stretched across most of the 17th century, every one of them certain the answer was just barely out of reach. But Wilfrid Voynich did not treat it as uncertain gossip. He treated it as a lead. He spent years promoting the manuscript publicly as the Roger Bacon Cipher manuscript, hoping the association with a known medieval genius, a man sometimes mythologized as an alchemist, an inventor, even a wizard in later folklore, would raise both its scholarly interest and its market value. It worked, in the sense that it made headlines. It did not work in the sense that Roger Bacon almost certainly had nothing to do with the book at all, as later science would go on to prove in a way nobody in 1912 could have anticipated. Still, that letter is the only solid thread connecting the manuscript to a real historical place and time before Voynich found it, the court of Rudolf II, in Prague, at the end of the 1500s. And that court, it turns out, is a genuinely strange enough setting that the story hardly needs Roger Bacon to stay interesting. Rudolf II was, by most accounts, a deeply unusual ruler, brilliant, reclusive, more interested in his cabinets of curiosities than in the ordinary business of governing an empire. He surrounded himself in Prague Castle with astronomers, including Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, doing genuine, era-defining science. But he also surrounded himself with alchemists chasing the philosopher's stone, astrologers casting horoscopes for the fate of nations, and collectors bringing him unicorn horns, mechanical automatons, and books nobody else understood. It was a court where the line between empirical science and outright magic had not yet hardened into the boundary we take for granted today, and Rudolf sat right at the blurry heart of it, endlessly fascinated by anything that promised secret knowledge. Two Englishmen who spent time at that court in the 1580s have become permanent suspects in the Voynich story: John Dee, a respected mathematician and astrologer who also served as an advisor and sometimes spy for Queen Elizabeth I, and his associate Edward Kelly, a man with a far murkier reputation, who claimed to communicate with angels through a crystal shoestone, and to have discovered the secret of transmuting base metal into gold. Dee kept detailed diaries of his time in Bohemia, and he is known to have owned strange manuscripts and to have had access to Rudolf's court. Kelly, for his part, was exactly the kind of charismatic operator who might plausibly manufacture an impressive-looking, unreadable book and sell it to a wealthy, credulous emperor for a fortune, the 16th century equivalent of a very elaborate con. It is a tidy theory. Dee or Kelly cooks up an elaborate fake, sells it to Rudolf for a small fortune, and the book then drifts down through history collecting a legend about Roger Bacon along the way, until it lands in a trunk in a Jesuit villa 3 centuries later. Tidy theories are seductive. They are also, in this case, almost certainly wrong, because of something nobody in 1912, and nobody in Prague in the 1580s, had any way of testing. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of slow, patient unraveling of an old mystery, letting your mind wander through centuries of dead ends and half-clues, consider subscribing to the channel before you drift off tonight. There are other evenings, and other unsolved histories, waiting for you here. Now let's look at the writing itself, because this is where the story stops being merely strange and starts being genuinely, stubbornly impossible. Researchers call the unknown script Voynichese. It has its own alphabet, somewhere between 20 and 30 distinct character shapes, depending on how you count certain variants, and it behaves, statistically, in ways that real, natural human languages behave. In the 1970s, a linguist and U.S. Navy codebreaker named Prescott Currier noticed that the manuscript was actually written in at least two distinguishable hands, now called Currier Language A and Currier Language B, each with subtly different letter and word frequencies, as if two different scribes, or two dialects, or two related but different writing systems, were both used across different sections of the same book. That alone tells you this was not somebody idly scribbling nonsense for an afternoon. Whatever this is, it was produced by more than one person, over what was likely a substantial stretch of time, following rules consistent enough that two different writers could both follow them. And the words themselves follow patterns real languages follow. Word lengths cluster the way real word lengths cluster. The most common words repeat with a frequency distribution that closely tracks Zipf's law, the same mathematical pattern you'd find if you measured word frequency in English, or Latin, or Mandarin. Certain characters appear almost exclusively at the beginning of words, others almost exclusively at the end, the same way certain letter combinations in English feel natural at the start of a word and strange at the end. There is internal structure. There is grammar-shaped behavior. It does not look like random noise, and it does not look, to most researchers who have studied it closely, like a simple substitution cipher either, a code where each Voynich character just stands in for one Latin letter, because the letter and word statistics don't match what a straightforwardly enciphered European language would produce. The man who arguably threw more resources at this problem than anyone in history was William F. Friedman, one of the most accomplished cryptologists of the 20th century. Friedman had helped break Japan's purple diplomatic cipher during the Second World War, arguably shortening the war and saving countless lives through that work alone. After the war, he assembled an informal group of some of the best codebreakers in the country, active and retired military cryptanalysts, working the Voynich Manuscript in their spare time across the 1940s and 1950s like a decades-long obsession they couldn't set down. Friedman had access to tools and mathematical techniques far beyond what Wilfred Voynich or Athanasius Kircher's era could offer: frequency analysis, statistical modeling, the entire apparatus of modern cryptanalysis. He failed. Not for lack of effort, and not for lack of skill. Friedman is, by any measure, one of the greatest codebreakers who ever lived. His final, carefully hedged conclusion, which he had encoded in an anagram in one of his own papers as a private joke, essentially argued that the manuscript was most likely an attempt at a constructed, artificial philosophical language, something like a made-up universal language project, centuries before anyone had heard of Esperanto, rather than a natural language hidden by a cipher. It was a serious, sophisticated hypothesis from a serious, sophisticated mind. It has also never been proven. Nobody has ever produced the underlying rule system Friedman believed must exist and made it actually generate readable Voynich text. Think about what that means, resting here in the dark with this problem. The most skilled codebreakers of the 20th century, armed with the tools that cracked Nazi Enigma machines and Japanese naval codes, sat with this 600-year-old book and simply could not open it. Whatever secret it holds, it has resisted the best-funded, best-trained cryptographic minds in modern history. For decades, the leading theory among people who wanted to dismiss the whole mystery was simple: it's a hoax. Somebody, at some point, invented gibberish that merely looks like language, wrapped it in mysterious illustrations, and either sold it as something more valuable than it was, or made it purely as an elaborate, private joke that outlived its creator by centuries. Wilfrid Voynich himself was, at various points, suspected of having forged it. A rare book dealer manufacturing his own miraculous find would hardly be the first time that happened in the history of the antiquities trade. Then, in 2009, a team led by Greg Hodgins at the University of Arizona used radiocarbon dating on small samples taken from the manuscript's vellum. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of a radioactive isotope of carbon that living things absorb while alive and stop absorbing the moment they die. In this case, the calfskin the vellum was made from. The results came back tightly clustered. The vellum dated to between 1404 and 1438, with very high statistical confidence. Separate analysis of the ink and pigments, carried out by Macron Associates, found materials entirely consistent with that same early 15th century window, with no anachronistic modern compounds anywhere in the mixture. That single piece of hard science quietly ended two theories at once. Roger Bacon, who died in the year 1292, could not possibly have written a book on vellum made from a calf that hadn't been born yet for over a century after his death, so whatever Rudolph II's court believed, or wanted to believe, about Bacon's authorship was simply wrong, a legend attached after the fact to a mysterious object that needed a famous name. And Wilfrid Voynich, dealer and occasional showman though he may have been, could not have forged a manuscript on 500-year-old vellum in the early 20th century. You cannot manufacture calfskin that has already been dead for 500 years. Whatever this book is, it is exactly what it appears to be on its surface, a genuine artifact of the early 1500s, likely made sometime in that century, in Europe, by someone with real skill, real intention, and real, sustained patience. That has not stopped people from claiming to have solved it. In 1921, a University of Pennsylvania scholar named William Romain Newbold announced he had cracked the code, describing an absurdly intricate system of microscopic shorthand hidden within apparent pen strokes, and claimed the book revealed Roger Bacon had invented the microscope centuries early. Other scholars, most devastatingly a colleague named John Manley, went back to Newbold's methodology and showed it could be used to extract virtually any message a person wanted from virtually any text. The decipherment said far more about Newbold's desperate ingenuity than about the manuscript. In 2019, a University of Bristol research associate named Gerard Cheshire published a paper claiming the manuscript was written in a lost Proto-Romance language and that he had fully translated it. The Medieval Academy of America, through the manuscript scholar Lisa Fagan Davis, issued a public rebuke within days, calling the work a case study in the dangers of academic overreach, that had somehow gotten past peer review despite failing basic tests any real decipherment should pass, such as, notably, producing a translation the author himself could actually read back consistently. There is a competing, more skeptical theory worth sitting with, too. In 2004, a psychologist named Gordon Rugg demonstrated that a fairly simple mechanical technique using a device called a card-end grill, essentially a table of word part combinations and a perforated card moved across it, could generate large amounts of Voynich-like gibberish text remarkably quickly, without the writer needing to understand a single word of what they were producing. Rugg wasn't claiming to have decoded the manuscript. He was demonstrating something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling, that all those language-like, statistical properties Friedman and others found so compelling could, in principle, emerge from a clever but essentially meaningless generation process, invented by someone in the early 15th century who wanted to produce an impressive, expensive-looking mystery, for profit, for status, or simply for the strange pleasure of making something no one else could ever open. Nobody knows which of these is true. Constructed philosophical language. In ciphered natural language nobody has found the right key for. An elaborate, patient hoax built 500 years before anyone thought to fake such a thing. Each explanation has serious defenders. None of them has ever been demonstrated beyond doubt. Let your attention drift now toward the pictures themselves, since whatever the words say, the illustrations were clearly meant to mean something to somebody. The largest section of the manuscript, roughly 130 pages, is usually called the herbal section, and it looks, at a glance, exactly like the plant catalogues that were common in medieval and early Renaissance Europe, each page devoted to a single plant, root system below, stem and leaves and flowers above, with a dense paragraph of Voynich's text beside it, presumably describing the plant's properties or uses. Except botanists who have spent careers studying medieval herbals have gone through the Voynich plants one by one, and almost none of them correspond cleanly to any real, identifiable species. Some look like plausible composites, a distinctive root borrowed from one real plant, fused onto leaves and flowers that belong to something else entirely, as if the illustrator was working from partial memory, from someone else's second-hand description, or was deliberately inventing hybrid, symbolic plants rather than recording real ones. Further into the book comes the astronomical section, built around a series of circular diagrams. Some scholars count roughly a dozen of these zodiac-style wheels, one loosely for each sign, though two are missing entirely, presumably on pages lost long before Voynich ever found the trunk they came in. Instead of the traditional zodiac symbols you'd expect, a ram, a bull, a pair of scales, each wheel is instead ringed with rows of tiny nude female figures, often around 30 per diagram, many holding stars on strings as if tethered to the points of light they represent. Bizarrely, the months labeling some of these diagrams appear to be written not in Voynichese but in tiny, faint Latin alphabet annotations using Old French or Occitan names for the months, a detail that has led some researchers to argue the manuscript, or at least these labels, may have passed through southern France or a French-speaking milieu at some point in its journey, centuries before it reached Prague. Then comes the section that unsettles first-time viewers more than any other, sometimes called the balneological section, from the Latin word for bathing. Page after page shows small, plainly drawn nude women, standing or sitting or half submerged in pools tinted a distinct green, the pools linked to one another through elaborate networks of tubes, pipes, and what look almost like plumbing fixtures or architectural conduits, sometimes shaped like intestines or veins. Nobody agrees on what this is depicting. Some researchers have proposed a women's health or gynecological manual, an idea partly built on the sheer number of female figures throughout the book, leading a few scholars to wonder, seriously, whether the manuscript could even have been compiled by or for women, an intriguing possibility in an era when formal, university-trained authorship was almost entirely closed to them. Others read the tubes as a diagram of the human body's internal plumbing, an allegory of anatomy and circulation rendered symbolically rather than literally. Others still connect it to the bathing culture and hydrotherapy traditions documented in genuine medieval spa towns. Nobody can say with confidence which, if any, of these is right. The book closes with a final section usually called the recipes, dozens of short paragraphs, each marked at its start with a small star or asterisk-like symbol in the margin, arranged the way genuine recipe or remedy collections from the period were typically organized, a formula, an instruction, a small illustration of an ingredient, repeated in a steady rhythm from page to page, right up until the text simply, quietly stops. By 2016, the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, which had acquired the manuscript in 1969 through the rare book dealer Hans Peter Krauss, made the decision to digitize the entire book at extremely high resolution and release every single page online, completely free, for anyone in the world to examine. It remains, by a wide margin, one of the most consulted items in their entire digital collection. Overnight, a mystery that had once belonged mostly to a small, dedicated circle of cryptographers and medievalists became a genuinely global obsession. Amateur linguists, hobbyist cryptographers, computer scientists, and simply curious insomniacs scattered across every time zone, all staring at the same 240 pages, all convinced that somewhere in there is a pattern everyone before them somehow missed. That openness has produced a steady, almost seasonal rhythm of triumphant headlines and quiet retractions. In 2014, a historical linguist named Stephen Bax published a modest, carefully qualified paper proposing tentative identifications for a small handful of individual words, a scattering of possible plant and star names, based on comparison with labeled illustrations elsewhere in medieval manuscripts. An approach almost everyone agreed was reasonable even though it never expanded into anything close to a full translation. In 2017, a television writer and researcher named Nicholas Gibbs claimed in a widely shared article that the manuscript was simply an abbreviated Latin medical reference guide for women's health, assembled from standard medieval abbreviations. Medievalists who actually specialize in reading genuine abbreviated Latin manuscripts took the claim apart within days, pointing out that his proposed system didn't actually decode consistently, and couldn't be reproduced by anyone else applying his own stated rules. In 2018, computer scientists at the University of Alberta, using natural language processing software, announced they had identified the underlying language as Hebrew, based on an algorithm's ranking of likely candidate languages, a claim that immediately drew criticism from cryptographers and computational linguists who pointed out that ranking a language as statistically closest is nowhere near the same thing as actually translating a single coherent sentence, and no coherent sentence ever followed. Multispectral and ultraviolet imaging, meanwhile, has quietly revealed something else. Faint traces of writing on the manuscript's very first folio that had been partially erased and written over, centuries ago, by someone other than the original scribes, a handful of barely legible words that some researchers have tentatively read as a fragment of Latin, though even that reading remains disputed and inconclusive. Somebody, at some point in this book's long journey, tried to leave their own mark on it, or perhaps tried to explain it, and even that attempt has come down to us broken and half-erased. So here you are, resting at the end of this long, patient look at a 600-year-old puzzle. The Voynich Manuscript sits today inside a climate-controlled vault at Yale's Beinecke Library, catalogued simply as MS-408, insured for a sum the university has never fully disclosed, occasionally brought out under careful supervision for scholars, and otherwise existing mostly as 240 extraordinarily high-resolution photographs, available to anyone with an internet connection, at any hour of the night, including this one. Every serious tool the last century of human ingenuity has produced has been turned on this book. Statistical linguistics, military-grade cryptanalysis, radiocarbon dating, multispectral imaging, machine learning. And every single one of those tools has told us a little more about what the manuscript almost certainly is not a hoax invented by its finder, not the work of Roger Bacon, not a straightforward substitution cipher hiding ordinary Latin, while telling us remarkably little about what it actually is. We know, with real scientific confidence, when it was made and roughly where. We know it was written fluently, by more than one hand, following rules consistent enough to look, in every measurable way, like a real language. And we still, after everything, cannot read a single sentence of it with any agreed-upon certainty. Maybe somewhere out there is a person, tonight, staring at the same glowing pages you might pull up tomorrow, who is one insight away from finally being right. Maybe the answer is something almost disappointingly simple, a private code invented by one restless, patient person 500 years ago for reasons that made perfect sense only to them, and died with them, the way so many small human secrets do. Maybe it never really said anything at all, and its entire 6 centuries of mystery are simply the shape of our own hunger for meaning, poured out onto very old, very patient vellum. We don't know. Nobody knows, not yet, and maybe not ever. But somewhere in that not knowing is its own kind of rest, a puzzle so old, so thoroughly examined, and so gently unresolved that it asks nothing more of you tonight than to sit with it a little while longer, and then, whenever you're ready, to let it go, and let yourself sleep.